The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial, San Diego. Rachel Torres moved through the shift change like water, finding the lowest point, a temp nurse in generic scrubs with no name badge yet, no locker assignment yet, no place in the hierarchy yet. That was fine. That was better. Invisibility was easier than questions. She clipped her badge to her waistband, temporary designation, laminate already scratched, and made her way to the medication station. Her hands were visible as she opened the automated cabinet, pulling vials of heparin and dopamine for the 8 patients in beds 1 through 8. The scars caught the light. Thin, precise surgical lines running along her knuckles and the backs of her hands, faded to silver after 2 years of careful healing and deliberate forgetting. 2 years since she'd walked away from the Special Forces Medical Unit at Fort Bragg, 2 years since the nightmare started wearing her down like water on stone, 2 years since she'd decided that anonymity was the only medicine that worked anymore. She inserted the 4-line into an elderly patient's arm with movements so controlled they looked robotic. 50-year-old Mr. Chen, post-cardiac surgery, recovering well. "You're good at this," he murmured, watching her work. Rachel didn't respond. The compliment belonged to someone else, someone with a name and a rank and a future that didn't require disappearing. She adjusted the drip rate, exactly 15 milliliters per hour, and moved on. The morning briefing started at 7. Rachel stood in the back of the conference room, still in her scrubs, while the day shift nurses and residents settled into their seats. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Hargrove, hadn't arrived yet. The charge nurse, Supervisor Williams, was pulling up patient charts on the screen. Rachel knew what was coming before the words left the speaker. New cardiac director, promoted from Mayo, built his reputation on the kind of medicine that valued hierarchy more than healing. She'd worked under men like that before. She understood the system. The door swung open at 7:03 a.m. Dr. Hargrove entered with the kind of presence that made people sit straighter. Tall, probably early 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's car payments. His watch was a Rolex, the kind that advertised success louder than his voice needed to. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and didn't look at anyone individually. He scanned the room the way a general surveys troops he hasn't yet decided to trust. "Morning, everyone," he said, voice pitched low and deliberate. "I'm Dr. James Hargrove. I'll be directing the cardiac unit here at Oak Creek. I've spent 17 years building a cardiac program at Mayo Clinic. I've published 42 peer-reviewed articles on cardiac intervention protocols. I've consulted for the American Heart Association. I'm here to bring that level of excellence to your ICU." He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for introductions. He simply sat and began speaking as if everyone had been waiting for this moment. "I understand that this unit has been running without clear leadership structure. That changes today. Every decision in this cardiac unit flows through me. Every patient interaction follows protocols I establish. Every resident who wants to advance their career will demonstrate competence according to my metrics." He paused, letting that settle. "I've reviewed your current staffing. We have some positions that need restructuring. Some team members who aren't pulling their weight." His eye swept the room like a searchlight. They paused on Rachel for exactly 1 second. Not recognition. Not assessment. The kind of dismissal that comes from deciding something isn't worth your attention. "Which one is the temp?" he asked Supervisor Williams, not looking back at Rachel. "That's Rachel," Williams said. "She's been with us 3 shifts so far. Good evaluations from the night nurses. She's reliable." Reliable. Hargrove said the word like it tasted of something inferior. "How long is the contract?" 90 days. Renewable based on performance. I'll want to review her work personally before we discuss renewal. I don't keep people around who don't meet my standards." He returned his attention to the patient census. "Let's talk about bed 1. Cardiac catheterization post-op, day 3. Who's managing fluids?" The conversation moved on. Rachel remained standing in the back, her hands folded in front of her in a way that looked casual but was actually tactical, arms at a neutral position where she could move instantly if needed. Her breathing stayed steady. Her jaw didn't clench. She'd learned in the first months at Fort Bragg that reactions were tells, and tells got you remembered, and being remembered was the last thing she wanted. But something in her chest tightened. The way he'd said temp, the way his eyes had dismissed her, the way he'd already decided she was disposable before he'd ever seen her work. She'd spent her entire military career proving that assumption wrong. She'd earned a Navy Cross proving that assumption wrong. She'd saved 14 lives in a firefight where she wasn't supposed to come out breathing, let alone breathing and functional and ready for the next casualty. And now she was standing in the back of a hospital conference room in San Diego, pretending not to be any of those things. The briefing lasted 45 minutes. Hargrove established his expectations with the precision of a man who'd learned that hospitals run on authority, not competence. He introduced 3 residents he'd apparently brought with him from Mayo, all of them nodding along to his words like they'd been trained on it. He mentioned that he'd be maintaining relationships with the hospital's board of directors, that his network of connections at Mayo would benefit the unit, that advancement in his program was something that had to be earned. When the meeting ended, Hargrove stood and walked toward the ICU floor without looking back. His residents followed in a line like baby ducks. Rachel waited until the room had cleared before moving. She collected the patient charts and made her way back to the medication station. It was 7:52 a.m. Her shift didn't end until 3:15 p.m. She had 7 hours and 23 minutes of careful, invisible work ahead of her. She prepared the morning medications in alphabetical order by patient name, which was faster than by room number, though nobody taught you that in nursing school. That was something you learned in a field surgical unit in Helmand Province when a medic next to you had 45 seconds to document 3 trauma cases and you had to work in a system faster than your hands could move. Pain is data. Speed is survival. She calculated drug dosages in her head because the computers sometimes went down and there was no room for delay. She'd learned that in Marja, where a 15-second calculation error meant someone's heart stopped. The ICU around her hummed with its own particular rhythm. Ventilators wheezed in steady intervals. Heart monitors beeped their plastic percussion. For pumps clicked and hissed. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath that, the particular scent of illness and fear, settled in the back of her throat the way it always did. She'd learned to breathe through it. At 11:07 a.m., she took her break in the employee lounge. Not the main staff lounge where Hargrove had already established himself, where the residents were talking about cases in the self-satisfied way of people who'd never had a patient die in their arms. She went to the smaller break room on the 3rd floor, the one nobody used, where an old television that got 3 channels and a couch with springs pushing through the upholstery sat waiting like abandoned furniture. She sat down. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was stable. But her eyes closed for just a moment, and the fluorescent lights above shifted, and suddenly it wasn't San Diego anymore. Marja. Helmand Province. 2:16 in the morning. The compound's east wall was taking fire and the second lieutenant had shrapnel in his femoral artery and he was going into hemorrhagic shock and her hands were moving on their own because panic was the enemy and her hands knew this. Tourniquet. 2 minutes. Pressure dressing. O2 climbing. The radio was screaming. Her partner, Corpsman Danny Kim, was working on the hosage, the girl, maybe 16, and they had maybe 90 seconds before the whole position overran. 90 seconds. That's what you got when the world was falling apart. 90 seconds and hands that remembered and a voice that could carry over the sound of the rotor wash from the incoming Black Hawk. Talk to me, Kim. And he was saying something about the girl's pupils dilating, and that's when the round came through and Kim's head went wrong and she was catching him and... Rachel's eyes opened. She was in the break room. The television was still running some daytime talk show. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her breathing had stayed steady, which was good. Compartmentalization was a skill you developed. You kept the nightmares in a lockbox and you went back to work and you did your job and you didn't let anyone see the cracks. She had 3 minutes left on her break. She stood and looked out the window down at San Diego spread below the hospital. 2 years since she'd left Fort Bragg. 2 years since anyone had called her by her rank. 2 years since she'd been anyone other than Rachel Torres, the temp nurse with steady hands and a tendency to keep her head down. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the fabric worn soft from 2 years of fingers running across it, and took a breath that held about 6 seconds of letting go. Then she walked back to the ICU. The shift had another 4 hours. The patients wouldn't know who she was. Hargrove already didn't care. That was good. That was exactly how she needed it to be. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The staff lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that comes from a room where nobody opens the windows. Rachel stood in the corner, pouring her second cup of the morning, when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. He sat near the window with 3 of his residents and 2 board members visiting for their quarterly tour. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been interrupted. "I give the temp exactly 1 week," he announced, setting down his espresso with the precision of someone placing a chess piece. "Anyone want to take that bet?" The residents laughed. One of them, a third-year named Marcus who had watched Hargrove dismiss Rachel twice already, leaned back in his chair. "What's the wager, Dr. Hargrove?" $50, Hargrove said smoothly. "She won't make it through Friday." Rachel's hand froze on the coffee pot. Her fingers tightened around the handle for exactly 1 measured breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to everything beneath them. She finished pouring, replaced the pot with controlled precision, and walked out of the lounge without turning around. Her scrubs made no sound against the tile. Nobody watched her leave except one of the board members, who glanced at Hargrove with an expression that might have been concern, then looked away. 2 days later, the cafeteria at 12:48 p.m. was crowded with the lunch shift, nurses, residents, orderlies, administrative staff all moving through the food line in the choreography of a hospital at midday. Rachel carried her tray past the doctor's table where Hargrove sat with the medical director, both of them deep in conversation about budget allocations and staffing models. Neither man looked up as she approached. Her tray held a salad, a cup of soup, and a bottle of water. The kind of meal someone eats when they're not sure if they'll have time to finish it. Hargrove extended his leg into the aisle at the last second, not a trip, exactly. Just a leg there that hadn't been there before. The tray caught his shoe. Physics happened. The bowl of soup tilted, then fell. The crash was catastrophic in its ordinariness, a sound that made every head in the cafeteria turn at the same moment. Soup splattered across 6 feet of tile in a pattern like blood spatter from a crime scene. The bowl shattered. Silverware scattered across the floor in 3 directions. The water bottle rolled under a table. A piece of lettuce landed on a surgeon's shoe. The cafeteria held its breath. Hargrove looked up from his plate with an expression of mock concern, the kind a man wears when he's acting at sadness. "Oh," he said, loud enough for the tables around him to hear. "Someone should really clean that up." The medical director didn't laugh, but he didn't tell Hargrove to help either. He just looked back at his plate. Rachel knelt slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind of slow motion that comes from a person counting something, breaths, heartbeats, maybe seconds. She began picking up pieces of the broken bowl, placing them carefully into her palm. 1 piece. Another. She could feel 50 pairs of eyes on her back now. The cafeteria noise had drained away. Even the clattering of silverware from the kitchen seemed to pause. One of Hargrove's residents snickered, a small sound, the kind that travels in silence. Rachel picked up the soup ladle. The broth dripped from its bowl onto the tile. She wiped a single tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, the one not holding the broken pieces. Her eyes remained fixed on the work in front of her, not breaking, not wavering, just present in her own reality while the rest of the cafeteria held theirs. Her breathing had shifted. It was deeper now, controlled like she was counting. One breath in. One breath out. One breath in. The kind of breathing a person learns in places where your lungs are all the backup you have. She gathered the water bottle from under the table. The salad. The napkins. She stood with the mess compressed into a careful stack, and she walked to the trash with her spine straight. Behind her, she heard forks on plates resume. Someone whispered. The cafeteria returned to its previous volume, but it had changed. Something had shifted in the room that nobody could name. Rachel disposed of the trash with methodical precision, wiped her hands, and returned to her shift without eating. The next morning, Hargrove intercepted her during rounds. He held a patient chart in his hands like it was a weapon he'd been waiting all night to use. He called her over loud enough that the entire care team turned to look. The resident he was supervising. The 2 nurses at the med station. The phlebotomist drawing labs on a patient 2 beds down. Torres, this documentation is unacceptable, Hargrove said. His voice had the texture of a man who had practiced this tone and perfected it. He didn't hand her the chart. He dropped it at her feet. Paper scattered across the tile in no particular order. Some slid under a nearby chair. One landed near the vital signs monitor. Rachel could see her own handwriting from where she stood, notes from a patient intake at 0600 hours, a medication reconciliation, a post-op assessment she'd completed while Hargrove was still drinking his first coffee. Pick that up, sweetheart, Hargrove said. The word sweetheart landed like a slap, delivered with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And try to write like you finished high school. He smiled at the resident. The resident smiled back. The care team shifted its weight from one foot to the other. The phlebotomist kept drawing blood. Rachel took one measured breath. Her hands were steady, which was remarkable given what was happening in her chest, that familiar tightening, the one that came before everything went sideways, the one she'd learned to recognize in Marja when the calls came in at 0300 hours and people started dying in the dark. She wipes a single tear from her cheek without breaking eye contact with the dropped chart, then knelt and began gathering the papers. Her movements were choreographed. There was no hesitation in them, no fumbling. She picked up each paper individually, checking to make sure she had them all, organizing them as she gathered them. The oxygen in her muscles had shifted to something colder. Something different. She stood, held the chart flat against her body, and looked directly at Hargrove with eyes like the surface of still water. I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor, she said. Her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk, quiet enough that it wasn't a shout, controlled enough that it made the entire care team stop breathing for exactly 2 seconds. Not threatening. Not angry. Just a statement of fact from someone who had seen things that made a dropped patient chart into something almost insignificant. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Excuse me. The documentation, Rachel said. I'll revise it within the hour. She turned and walked toward the supply closet with the same controlled pace she'd used to pick up the soup. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her back. Even Hargrove seemed momentarily uncertain of what he'd been about to do. 3 minutes later, alone in the supply closet surrounded by stacks of dressing changes and 4 bags, Rachel's hands finally trembled. She pressed them against the wall, feeling the cold tile under her palms, breathing the sharp sterile smell of gauze and antiseptic. Her medic partner's name was Santiago. He had a tattoo of his daughter's handprint on his shoulder. In Marja, on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, Santiago didn't come back from the firefight. The unit lost 14 people that day. Rachel got 3 of them stabilized enough to helicopter out. She didn't get Santiago. 2 years later, in a supply closet in San Diego, she was still cleaning up messes. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. 2 days after the cafeteria incident, the trauma alert sounds like a siren cutting through prayer. Incoming SEAL Team 3, Commander level, critical GSW to the thorax, ETA 4 minutes. Rachel's hand still mid-chart when she hears it. The ICU freezes. Everyone knows SEAL means complicated, means brass, means every move gets documented twice. She keeps her eyes on the monitor display, but her shoulders have already straightened. This is what she's trained for. This is what she's been running from. The helicopter touches down at 1,347 hours. Commander Marcus Richter arrives on a stretcher with 2 corpsmen flanking him like shadows, their bearing military precise, their faces locked in that particular expression of controlled rage that comes from watching your CO bleed out and keeping moving anyway. The trauma team rolls him through the double doors, and Rachel sees the name on the chart, and something in her chest goes very still. Richter. Danny's commanding officer. Her son's CO. The man who approved the last 3 combat ops that nearly killed her boy. She doesn't move. She watches the emergency team hustle Richter toward the OR, and she realizes what this means. Hargrove will see her reaction. He'll use it. He'll weaponize her concern the same way he weaponized her professionalism, because that's what men like him do. They take anything human and turn it into evidence of weakness. Torres. Hargrove appears beside her like oil spreading across water. You're on Richter's post-op recovery. Round the clock until day 3, then we reassess. He doesn't ask if she can handle it. He's assigning her the case because he knows she can't handle it objectively, and that's exactly what he wants, a chance to prove her emotional investment compromises her judgment. I'll be monitoring his care very closely. His Navy brass. Any complications, any delays, any decisions made without my direct approval, and you'll be explaining it to hospital administration. He walks away before she can respond, which is fine. She doesn't have words anyway. Richter makes it through surgery. 9 hours of surgical repair on a penetrating wound that came 3 inches from his left anterior descending artery. The cardiothoracic surgeon, Dr. Paulson, 62, actually competent, closes him at 2,156 hours and wheels him to the ICU recovery bay with strict instructions, vitals every 15 minutes for the first 6 hours, then every 30 minutes, telemetry continuous, nothing by mouth, pain management conservative. Rachel reads the post-op orders 3 times, then reviews Richter's chart from the beginning. Service record. Rank structure. Operational background. She's looking for context, some way to understand how her son serves under this man, and also some way to stop caring if something goes wrong because caring is the thing that will destroy her. The first night, Richter sleeps off the anesthesia like a stone dropped in water. His vitals are textbook, BP holding steady at 118/72, heart rate in the 60s, oxygen saturation at 97% on room air. Rachel marks each reading with precision, checking the sutures, the chest tube, the telemetry leads. Her hands move through the routine with absolute professionalism. Hargrove walks rounds at midnight, stands at Richter's bedside for exactly 3 minutes, reviews her charting with a thin smile, and says nothing. His silence is a trap. He's waiting for her to slip. By the second post-op day, Richter is alert and irritable in the way that means his healing. He asks Rachel questions about his repair, about timeline for discharge, about whether the Navy will clear him for active duty. She answers each one with the tone of a nurse discussing any patient's recovery arc, but somewhere under her ribs, something is clenching. Because Richter asking about active duty means he'll go back. It means Danny will fly out on another op. It means the cycle that scarred her twice will turn again. You military? Richter asks on the evening of day 2. His voice still rough from intubation, but sharp. SEAL voices always are, they cut through noise. No, sir. The lie comes out smooth as oil. She adjusts his for without breaking rhythm. Nursing background. No combat experience. Could have fooled me. The way you move around that crash cart. He studies her for a second, and she feels the weight of his attention like a physical thing, like a scope being sighted. You ex-military. My brother served. Another lie, or a half-truth, or a rearrangement of facts that accomplishes the same goal, deflection. I'm just careful with my work. Hargrove appears in the doorway as if summoned by the sound of her voice. He doesn't approach the bed. He just watches, taking notes on his iPad, his eyes tracking the space between Rachel and Richter like he's looking for something unprofessional to document. When Rachel meets his gaze, she sees what he's calculating, that her connection to this patient, whatever it is, has made her unreliable. That he can use that. Day 3 starts ordinary. Vitals stable. Richter asking to sit up, to move around the room, to start eating solid food. Rachel clears the requests with Paulson, adjusts the monitors, helps Richter navigate the careful choreography of movement with a chest tube still in place. At 1,410 hours, she's checking his surgical site when she notices his neck. The veins. They're distending slightly, visible above the clavicle in a way they weren't 30 minutes ago. His skin has taken on a faint bluish tint at the nail beds. She checks his blood pressure manually, 94/58. The automatic cuff had read 107/69 20 minutes ago. She pulls the stethoscope from her pocket, listens to his heart. The sounds are muffled, as if his heartbeat is coming from behind glass. Distant. Dampened. Pericardial fluid. Blood in the sac surrounding the heart. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis crystallizes in her mind with the absolute certainty of someone who has seen it before, who has treated it before, who has watched soldiers die from it in operating theaters that smelled like diesel fuel and human copper. Dr. Hargrove, she says, keeping her voice level and quiet, the professional nurse voice she's perfected over 2,000 shifts. I think we have tamponade. I need you here now. Hargrove is across the ICU reviewing labs with his residents. He doesn't look up immediately. When he does, he moves with the measured pace of someone who doesn't believe an interruption is urgent. He walks over slowly, and Rachel can see the dismissal already forming in his expression. His pressures were fine an hour ago, Torres. Don't be dramatic. He doesn't even look at Richter. He's looking at her, at the slight flush in her cheeks, at her hands gripping the bedrail, reading her emotion as a confirmation of her incompetence. His jugular veins are distended. BP just dropped 18 points. Muffled heart sounds, Beck's triad, doctor. She doesn't add emphasis. She doesn't raise her voice. The facts are the facts, and they carry their own weight. Hargrove walks to the bedside with academic curiosity, the way a professor approaches an interesting but ultimately unimportant problem. He glances at the monitor. Richter's oxygen saturation is 89% and falling like a stone, and then at the patient himself. Richter's eyes are starting to roll slightly upward. His breathing has become labored, shallow, the breathing of a man whose heart cannot pump enough blood to fill his lungs. The room carries the smell of sweat and antiseptic and something else underneath, the coppery tang of internal bleeding. We should observe, Hargrove says, his voice carrying the tone of a man making a reasonable clinical decision. Call cardiology. We'll get an echo to confirm before we do anything invasive. Richter's monitor alarm screams. All 3 lines converge toward a horizon line that means nothing, no pulse, no pressure, no oxygen saturation. His body goes rigid. His eyes roll back until only the whites are visible. Hargrove stares at the crashing vitals, and something in his face freezes. Not fear. Panic. The look of a man who has just realized he made a catastrophically wrong decision and is about to be publicly accountable for it. His mouth opens. Nothing comes out. The ICU staff moves into crash protocol automatically. Someone's running for the crash cart, another resident is calling for cardiology, a nurse is starting compressions. But Richter doesn't have time for any of it. He has roughly 2 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes brain death. Rachel's hands move before her mind has time to catch up. 20 years of muscle memory. 3 deployments worth of battlefield medicine. She's already reached for the pericardiocentesis needle in the emergency kit, 18 gauge, curved, with a syringe attached. She's already cleansed the insertion point below Richter's xiphoid process with sterile technique that doesn't require anyone's permission. She's already identified the anatomical landmarks, the angle, the depth, the exact space where the needle needs to travel to reach the pericardial sac without collapsing the left ventricle. Torres, wait for cardiology. Hargrove's voice sounds distant, almost muted, like it's coming from underwater. She doesn't wait. She can't wait. Waiting means death. The needle slides in at a precise 45-degree angle, her hands absolutely steady in a way they never are alone at 3 in the morning. She aspirates. Blood. 60 cubic centimeters of blood pooling in the syringe, blood that should be inside Richter's circulatory system, not strangling his heart. She pulls back carefully, methodically, the way she was trained in a field hospital in Marja when the alternative to success was leaving body bags behind. Richter gasps. His monitor beeps. 1 spike. 2 spikes. A rhythm. Sinus rhythm. His oxygen saturation climbs, 89 to 91 to 94 to 97%. His BP stabilizes at 106/64. His eyes focus. He's breathing on his own, conscious, alive. 90 seconds. That's all it took. The ICU staff stands motionless. The machines beep their normal rhythms. A resident takes over Richter's stabilized care, adjusting drips, confirming the pericardial drain is secure, running an EKG to assess for any ischemic changes. No one is looking at Rachel. No one is moving. The silence is the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room has just witnessed something they're not sure they saw. Hargrove's face cycles through white to red to a grey-white that suggests his blood pressure is dropping. He opens his mouth. Closes it. His jaw works silently, like he's chewing on something that tastes like bile. My office. His voice comes out low and controlled, but Rachel can see the tremor in his hands. Now. Rachel sets down the syringe carefully, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the crisis is past, the adrenaline dropping like a cliff. She doesn't look at Hargrove. She doesn't look at Richter. She simply stands, smooths her scrubs, and walks past Hargrove toward the door, aware of every pair of eyes in the ICU following her movement, aware that whatever happens next will redefine everything that came before. The walk to his office takes 18 seconds. Within 2 hours of Rachel stepping out of the ICU, Hargrove's phone was already ringing. The medical director. The hospital's legal counsel. Someone from the state licensing board named Jim, whose voice Hargrove kept laughing at like they were old friends. By the time he summoned Rachel to his office on the 4th floor, he had already begun constructing the architecture of her professional destruction with the precision of a man who had spent 23 years learning exactly which strings to pull. She arrived at 3:48 p.m., still wearing her blood-spattered scrubs. 2 security officers flanked the doorway, not aggressive, not yet, but present in a way that made the air in the room taste like copper and anticipation. Hargrove sat behind his mahogany desk, 3 file folders arranged in front of him like evidence at trial. The late afternoon sun came through the windows at an angle that made everything look like a courtroom scene from a film nobody wanted to watch. Sit, he said. Not a request. A command wrapped in a single syllable. Rachel remained standing. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He set down his pen with deliberate precision. I've spent the last 90 minutes on the phone with hospital administration, the medical director, and a consultant from Johns Hopkins who specializes in protocol violations. He opened the first folder. I've also contacted every reference listed on your application. Pharmacy in Arlington, Virginia. They've never heard of you. Nursing school in Maryland, no record. Previous employers all the way back to 2015. Nothing. It's remarkable, really. It's as if you don't exist before you walked through our doors. The fluorescent lights above hummed their endless mechanical song. Rachel's expression remained flat, but her fingers curled slightly, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. I've initiated an emergency investigation into your credentials, Hargrove continued, his voice taking on the smooth cadence of a man delivering a verdict he'd already rehearsed. Practicing beyond scope. Performing an invasive procedure, cardiac drainage, without direct physician authorization. That's not heroic, Torres. That's insubordination. That's ego masquerading as medicine. He leaned back in his chair. I've brought in an outside consultant who will review every credential you submitted, every reference you claimed, every moment you've worked in this hospital. And I'm convening an emergency board review to determine whether your license should be suspended pending investigation. He slid a document across the desk. A resignation form. The paper hissed against the polished wood. You have two options. You can resign effective immediately for personal reasons, no investigation, no public inquiry, just a clean separation. You take it, you move on, nobody asks difficult questions about who you really are. He paused, letting the silence crystallize between them. Or we proceed with the investigation, which will be very thorough, very public, and very permanent. Your choice. Rachel looked at the form for exactly 10 seconds. Her breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't tremble. But something behind her eyes, something that looked like the moment before a door slammed shut forever, flickered and went dark. I saved his life, she said quietly. You violated protocol. He would have died. Probably, Hargrove agreed, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow worse than anger. But that's not how we practice medicine, is it? We follow procedure. We respect hierarchy. We don't have cowboys coming in from nowhere, performing battlefield medicine in a civilian hospital, acting like they know better than the physicians who trained for this. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Commander Richter will recover. The outcome doesn't change the violation. In fact, it makes it worse. It proves you're dangerous. Because next time, your improvisation kills someone. And then we're liable. Then I'm liable. He nodded to the security officers. The movement was small but absolute. Escort her out. Personal items, under supervision. She surrenders her badge and her access credentials immediately. She's suspended pending the board's determination, but frankly, we'll have your resignation long before that hearing happens. You'll want to resign. Trust me. The security officers didn't touch her. They didn't need to. One of them simply gestured toward the door with an expression of professional neutrality that was somehow more devastating than aggression. Rachel looked at Hargrove for a moment, really looked at him, and something in her face shifted. Not anger. Not fear. Something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. Of what he was. Of what she was losing by standing in this room any longer. She picked up the resignation form without signing it and walked toward the door. The security officers followed at a distance that was close enough to be humiliating. 20 minutes later, Rachel stood at a bus stop on 4th Avenue, 3 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, holding a cardboard box that was slowly soaking through in the rain. The November weather had turned vicious, the kind of cold that came in off the Pacific and settled into your bones like grief. Water ran down her face, but she wasn't crying. She was just standing there, letting the rain do what it wanted. Inside the box, the cracked navy mug from Marja. That beautiful, worthless thing that had survived an IED blast and a firefight and 2 years of hiding. The dying succulent she'd kept in her locker for 8 months, forgetting to water it more weeks than not, a plant that shouldn't have survived either but somehow had, hanging on in its plastic pot with leaves that looked like tissue paper. And the photograph. Sarah Chen's face. 26 years old. Medic, 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company. Killed in action November 14, 2022, Marja Valley, Helmand Province. Rachel still had the notification memorized. Still dreamed about the moment the rounds came through the compound wall. Still woke up some nights reaching for Sarah's hand, forgetting for a few seconds that there was nothing left to reach for. The unit patch was draped over the box, soaking through with the rain. The embroidered insignia, 2 cross tridents, a bomb, an anchor, was starting to bleed color onto the cardboard. She'd sewn it into her jacket lining the day she left Fort Bragg. Kept it pressed against her ribs like a second heart, something nobody could see, something that proved she'd been real. That the years had happened. That the scars weren't just phantom pain. A bus pulled up. The doors hissed open. The driver looked at her with the particular expression of exhaustion that came from driving the same route for 12 years and seeing the same kinds of people at the same bus stops, day after day. People in cardboard boxes and rain-soaked scrubs. People who'd lost things they couldn't name. Rachel didn't get on. She just stood there, watching the doors hiss shut and the bus pull away, its red taillights bleeding into the rain like watercolor paint. 4th Avenue stretched out in both directions, empty, indifferent, a city street that didn't care who stood on its sidewalks or what they were carrying or who they used to be. Disappearing had always seemed like the right choice. The only choice. After Marja, after Sarah, after the year of nightmares and the hands that shook when she tried to sleep and the way silence had become the only medicine that worked, she'd walked away from everyone. Not cruelly. Just quietly. Changed her name on paperwork. Took the temp nursing gig. Moved into a studio apartment with beige walls and a window that looked at another building. Became invisible. That was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to be safety. But standing at the bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box and a dying plant and her dead friend's photograph, Rachel Torres understood something she'd spent 2 years trying not to face: disappearing wasn't safety. It was just a slower version of the same thing that had taken Sarah. It was dying in installments. It was becoming a ghost while your body still breathed. She'd hidden from the world to protect it from the person she was. But what if the world needed her? What if there were people who'd bleed out in ICU beds unless someone came in and did what needed to be done, protocol or no protocol, hierarchy or no hierarchy? What if walking away from her own life meant walking away from other people's lives too? The rain fell harder. The box was disintegrating. The unit patch sank deeper into the cardboard, drowning in moisture and weather and time. And Rachel stood there in her blood-spattered scrubs, holding the only things that proved she'd ever been a soldier, a medic, someone who knew how to hold people together when everything was falling apart. Holding the only things that proved she was still alive. The question wasn't whether she'd made the right choice walking away from the Navy. The question was whether staying hidden, whether becoming this version of Rachel Torres, invisible and small and temporary, was a second chance or just another way to disappear. Whether working in civilian hospitals and hiding behind temp shifts and keeping her son in the dark about who she really was meant she was healing, or just slowly, quietly, drowning. A car pulled up to the bus stop. A man rolled down his window, asking if she needed a ride. Rachel didn't answer. She just stood there in the December rain, watching the water drip through the holes in the cardboard box, watching the unit patch sink deeper, watching the photograph of her friend get slower and slower as the ink began to fade, wondering if this, standing alone in the rain, holding the pieces of a life she'd tried to leave behind, was the bravest thing she'd done since Marja, or the final surrender to grief she'd been running from for 2 years. Wondering if some people weren't meant to disappear at all. Wondering if some battles couldn't be won by walking away from them, and some soldiers couldn't save themselves, only other people. The rain fell. The city lights came on. And Rachel Torres stood at the bus stop, waiting for something she couldn't name, holding on to things she was too afraid to let go of, caught between 2 versions of herself, the one she was trying to be and the one the world was about to discover she'd always been. 3 days after the termination papers, Rachel Torres pushed through the glass doors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing civilian clothes for the first time in months. The cardboard box was gone. She'd stopped carrying it somewhere between the bus stop and this morning. Her paycheck sat waiting at the HR department on the 3rd floor, sealed in a manila envelope with her name printed in red ink, a final bureaucratic insult wrapped in efficiency. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath it, something like endings. The elevator doors hissed open. She didn't press the button for 3. Instead, she found herself walking toward the ICU, toward the unit where 14 days ago she'd performed a procedure that should have gotten her promoted and instead got her fired. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of medical white, the color of institutions that moved faster than individual lives. Her feet made almost no sound on the tile. The ICU doors opened onto controlled chaos. A stretcher was rolling in from the ambulance bay, paramedics calling vitals in that clipped paramedic shorthand that sounds like a language Rachel understood in her bones. Trauma incoming. Unconscious male, approximately 40, found unresponsive in a warehouse in National City. The nurses scrambled into formation like this was choreography they'd rehearsed 1,000 times, because they had. Rachel stopped at the nurses' station, watching. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere. The trauma patient was wheeled past her. Dark hair matted with sweat. Moderate beard. A pattern of scarring on his hands that made her breath catch, scarring from blast fragmentation, the kind that came from being close when something exploded. The ICU team began the intake assessment, stripping his clothes, checking for injuries, establishing access. One of the new nurses, a kid named Derek, maybe 23, started the initial workup while Dr. Mendez, the attending on duty, began the rapid exam. Rachel turned to leave. This wasn't her fight anymore. This wasn't her unit. This wasn't. The trauma patient's eyes opened. Just slightly. Consciousness flickering like a light bulb struggling to turn on. His gaze swept the room, unfocused, confused. Then it landed on Rachel. Stopped. His pupils dilated. His hand moved, reaching toward something he couldn't grab, and his mouth formed words that didn't come at first, then came all at once, rough and broken and in English that carried an accent she recognized from somewhere buried deep in her operational history. You. His voice was gravel and water. Marja. You are from Marja. The ICU went quiet. Not gradually. All at once. Like someone had pulled a plug. Rachel felt every pair of eyes shift toward her. Felt the weight of simultaneous attention, the kind of attention she'd spent 2 years running from. She didn't move. She didn't blink. But her hand clenched at her side, and the trembling wasn't her body. It was the past showing up unannounced, standing in a hospital bed, speaking her location in broken English. You saved my brother. The man's words came faster now, his consciousness climbing like a fever climbing. When your unit came through our village. My brother was shot. He was bleeding. You stayed. You put pressure on the wound when your commanders wanted to move. You stayed. You saved him. Rachel's voice, when it came, was barely audible. I don't know you. You don't know me. But I know you. I remember your face. I was 10 years old. I watched you save my brother's life when you had no reason to. The patient's eyes were clear now, fever-bright with the intensity of a memory that had clearly survived 18 months and geography and war and displacement and whatever had brought him here to this hospital in San Diego, unconscious and seeking asylum. You were not a soldier to us. You were an angel. The ICU doors opened. Danny Torres stood in the entrance in his dress blues, visiting hours for his commander, and Rachel saw the exact moment his brain processed what he was hearing. Saw his shoulders go rigid. Saw his face recalibrate from casual interest to something harder, something that looked like fear. He walked toward them, each step controlled. Mom, what is he talking about? Danny's voice came out in a register she'd never heard from him before, not quite angry, not quite shocked, something in between that sounded like betrayal. Wait. What's your rank? Rachel met her son's eyes. Didn't look away. Daniel. Your rank, Mom. The silence stretched. The machines around them filled it with beeping, the standard rhythm of survival, the background hum of lives being monitored and measured. The trauma patient lay in the bed, watching her like she held the key to something fundamental. The nurses stood frozen between one task and another, unsure what protocol covered this particular moment. Derek the young nurse had his hands halfway to and for stand and didn't move them. Rachel read the patient's file on the monitor beside the bed. Khalid Ahmadi. Age 42. Afghan national. Seeking asylum status. And there, on the intake form, scanned from the paramedic paperwork, a faded description of a scar on his left shoulder. She knew that scar. She'd cleaned that scar. She'd sutured that scar while gunfire snapped overhead, and her medic partner Sarah called out rounds, and the village elder's 10-year-old son had held his older brother's hand in the dark. Commander Richter's voice came from the trauma bay. He was sitting up in his hospital bed 15 feet away, for still running into his forearm, and his voice carried the weight of command authority, even diminished by 3 days of post-op recovery. That woman is Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. He spoke like he was reading an official citation, each word precisely placed. Navy Cross. 2 Silver Stars. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. I commanded the operation she supported in Marja, and she saved 14 lives in a firefight that should have killed us all. Danny's knees buckled slightly. He sat down on the nearest chair without asking permission. His eyes filled with something that looked like grief for a version of his mother that he'd never known existed, that had been living across the table from him his entire life, spooning soup into soup bowls while keeping the weight of her history sealed behind her ribs like a classified file. An FBI liaison appeared at the ICU entrance, having been called for the trauma intake regarding Khalid Omodi's asylum case. She was wearing a badge and carrying a folder and moving with the efficient precision of someone who'd handled 1,000 bureaucratic complications. She stopped walking when she saw Rachel. Her eyes changed. Recognition moved through her face like a door opening. Senior Chief Torres. Not a question. A statement of fact. Your medical unit was part of a classified hostage rescue operation in Marja. You're in our witness protection consideration files. Rachel said nothing. What was there to say? The silence held anyway. It held the weight of everything she'd been trying not to be, everything she'd been afraid to carry into rooms full of people who might ask questions. The silence held Marja and held the faces of the local nationals she'd treated, and held the reason she'd walked away from a career that had defined her for 12 years and 3 tours and 2 wars that blurred together into one long night she'd been trying to wake up from. 2 floors down, in the IT department, Marcus Chen watched his monitoring system light up like a Christmas tree. Someone was attempting to access and delete security footage from the hospital servers. Someone was logging in with administrative credentials. Someone was trying to erase the past 14 days of their own documented behavior. Marcus had been a combat medic before he got his IT certification, had served with people like Rachel Torres, understood the weight of institutional loyalty misplaced. He didn't hesitate. He copied every frame to 3 separate external drives, then forwarded the complete security archive to the hospital board with a formal complaint attached, CC'd legal, CC'd the medical director, CC'd 3 copies to his own email address for documentation. In Dr. Hargrove's office, the computer screen showed nothing but a frozen cursor. The files were already gone. But Hargrove didn't know that yet. He kept clicking, kept trying, his mouse hand trembling with the particular fear of a man watching his institutional power collapse in real time. The medical director appeared at his door with 2 security officers, and the words that came out of her mouth were the ones Hargrove had used on Rachel 3 days earlier, reproposed and delivered with the same surgical precision. Surrender your badge. Pending investigation. Effective immediately. The ICU staff watched through the glass wall as Dr. Hargrove was escorted out by officers he'd once commanded, his career exiting the building on the same schedule Rachel's had. 6 months later, Rachel Torres stood in the Naval Base Chapel in full dress whites, her service decorations bright and precise against the immaculate fabric. The reinstatement ceremony was small, 20 people maximum, the people who needed to be there and no one else. Commander Richter read the official orders reinstating her rank, recognizing her service, welcoming her back into the institutional structure she'd been trying to escape. Danny stood beside her in his own dress blues, finally understanding why his mother's hands never shook when she worked, why her eyes never looked away from the hardest moments, why she'd needed silence to survive. The cracked Navy mug sat on the desk in her new office at Naval Medical Training Command, not Oak Creek Memorial, but a different institution, one where she would spend the next decade teaching Navy corpsmen and combat medics what Marja had taught her. The succulent beside it, neglected for months, had finally started to grow. Khalid Omodi's asylum had been granted partly on Rachel's testimony about the humanitarian mission in Marja, partly on the power of a 10-year-old boy's memory finally becoming evidence that mattered. He'd written her a letter, written it in careful English, explaining that her unit's mercy had changed his understanding of the entire war. Dr. Hargrove taught CPR fundamentals now at a community college in El Centro, minimum wage, teaching the chest compressions he'd never mastered himself, watched constantly by institutional systems he'd once weaponized. The security footage Marcus Chen had saved had revealed a pattern, not just Rachel, but 6 other staff members, all treated with the same casual cruelty, all enduring the same institutional indifference. His medical license was suspended for 18 months. His reputation, when it finally dried, cracked like old paint. Rachel placed the unit patch, the one that had been sewn inside her jacket lining for 2 years, faded and fragile with age, into a frame. She hung it in the chapel memorial wall beneath Sarah's name, her medic partner who hadn't made it out of Marja, and finally let herself cry in front of witnesses who understood the weight of scars. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you found yourself wondering what you'd do in Rachel's position, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe for more stories about the strength hidden in plain sight. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me, would you have stayed hidden, or would you have stood up? Let's talk about it.